Just a quick reminder that these Devos are recorded live every Wednesday at noon on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/Orchard Christian Fellowship. So if you want to be involved in the chat, uh, then join us Wednesdays at noon. Now enjoy this Devo.
For the devotion, we're going to start with a question, and the question is, um, who is your enemy? Jackson, who's your enemy?
Who's my enemy?
Do you
Huh.
have an enemy?
I don't make enemies.
I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Well, I don't make friends either. I'm completely neutral in all aspects of life.
Oh my goodness. So the question's like kind of weird because I don't know. I think if we're honest, there are like people that we compete against. I remember when I was a kid, one of my best friends growing up was also my arch nemesis. So he was my enemy. His name was Tony. He was awesome, but we competed in everything. So even though he was my friend, when we would be put against each other, we would want to destroy each other in any and everything. And we were Christians. We grew up in the church. This was like Awanas and youth group and all this stuff. And then I think of like when I played on sports teams, you had like your rival, or like any team that you played against, you called them the enemy. I think if we get real about it, politically, you see like the two major political parties, and people definitely have that mindset of the other party is the enemy.
Hmm.
Um, but I just have started seeing this word in scripture, and it's something that um, just makes me think. In core, the young men's small group that we have for our middle and high school boys, we've been talking about the armor of God, and we had this statement that God, if God gives us armor, then there's a war to fight, and if there's a war to fight, that means there's an enemy, and He makes it clear that the enemy is sin, and the the owner of that, Satan, right? Like the devil, his minions, the supernatural powers of evil. That's what it says in Ephesians, I think, is where those verses are. Um, and so that would be our enemy. But as I was reading through some of these Psalms these past couple of weeks, like our weekly Devo people know, I've been trying to read a Psalm a day. And so some of the inspiration from these devotionals are actually coming from the Psalms that I read. And as I was reading it, I was reading like a good portion of these are from David. And when you read these things from David, he's saying stuff like, God, smite my enemies, rain down fire upon them, like destroy them, thwart their plans. And it doesn't necessarily sound like he is talking about the devil, or he's like talking about the evil powers. There's actually one that I was gonna read. It was Psalm 55. So this is a psalm from David, and he starts out, give ear to my prayer, O God, hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Um, my heart is in anguish. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. So he's kind of sorrowful, and um, he is talking about his enemy. And he says in verse 9, Destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from its marketplace. Then he says this in verses 12 through 15. For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house, we walked in the throng. Let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is their dwelling place and in their heart. So the enemy that he's actually talking about in this passage is his friend, a companion, somebody who he was close with, right? And I think all of us can identify with that. We've all had personal friends that have like hurt us. But I don't know. This week for the Devo, I was just thinking about this concept of enemies, and is that word fluid? Like, what do you think about that? Is there like these people are enemies? Are they enemies because of the sin that they affirm? Or can that word be fluid? Can you have like interactions with people, maybe even loved ones, where they end up becoming an enemy for a time? Like, I'm curious. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know necessarily like with the current, world slash everywhere definition of enemy. I don't know if that's necessarily, what we're talking about here because we talked about this yesterday, which you weren't there, but at Core with the Boys group, we talked about how our enemies are never actually people. They're either the things that they do or just like, you know, the devil and his ways that have like overcome people. Um,
Mm,
so I think enemies is kind of like a fluid word in terms of the demons within people, the personal demons within people are sometimes there and kind of visible through people, and sometimes they aren't.
mm. Yeah, it's very intriguing that when Jesus is speaking about enemies, he says a couple of things, right? If we look in the New Testament, in the apostles' writings, they would say that our enemy is not of flesh and bone, but it's of the supernatural powers of evil. It's Satan, his minions, right? It is sin. Um, but then when we look at Jesus, he actually says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And I think we hear that sometimes, and we just have the idea of, oh yeah, the golden rule, just like be nice, be kind to people. Um, but I wonder if he's actually sharing a tactic of how you attack and defeat your real enemy by loving people who are against you. Because in truth, that was us. We were enemies of God, born in sin, in open rebellion from God,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what did he do? He loved us. He gave his life for us, paying the punishment for sin, death, and the grave. And then upon belief in him, we now are set free from the enemy. So, in all reality, when he says verses like love your enemies, what he's doing is he's sharing the tactic for how you defeat an enemy. You love them, you pray for them. Why? Because you engage in the supernatural reconciliation of their heart, because that is actually what God did for us. And I think even in that thought, there's another truth of people cannot be our enemies if they are made in God's image as we are. Because if they're made in God's image as we are, then they're God's children that need to be redeemed. And where this gets messy and like where we're not going to talk about right now is the whole idea of, things like just war theory, or, oh, Kevin, that's all like good and well, but if someone if you go fight, you have an enemy, and you can't just like go hug them. That's actually not what you do. And so yes, there are some like messy gray areas, or there's consequences for people's actions. Like if someone comes into my house and tries to threaten me or my family, I'm going to love them. I'm also going to defend myself, so like there's a little bit of gray there, but that's not what we deal with every day, right? We deal with the spiritual enemy that not only is in us, but is in other people as well. If I was going to be honest and say who my enemy is right now, I think the first thing that I would say is myself. I am my own worst enemy. Like there's so much that I am fighting in myself to really forgive, to give grace to overcome temptation. Like there's enough of a battle in there that I don't even have to worry about other people. And matter of fact, Jesus even makes that clear when he says, take the log out of your eye before you can take the speck out of someone else's eye, right? This idea of focusing on ourselves before we focus on others. Um, but I'd also go so far to say that I think that when we look at enemy, we have to look at the supernatural side of it. And if there is someone who goes against things that we believe, or someone who would even maybe identify us as their enemy, um, or who we identify as an enemy of our cause or of our beliefs, God's response to that and his tactic is to love them. And so I wonder what it looks like this week for us to actually love enemies of us or enemies of God. Like if you, I'm trying to think like who would you say would be an enemy of God right now?
I mean, I can think of a lot.
I got a list.
There are plenty of people, and
Mm,
people that not necessarily like the subtle people who like maybe just don't have a belief in God, but there are people who are outspoken enemies of God. They hate God. And,
mm-hmm.
you know, that's the easiest example. But then again, there are the more subtle examples, and that's less of they're less of enemies of God, but more just they don't know him yet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean like I can even think of just people in my life. There's a guy that I know that I see just about every week and he will ridicule my faith. He'll like make a joke of it. You know, anytime something good happens, oh, God must have wanted you to have that, Kevin, or something bad happens. What did you do to have God smite you, Kevin? You know, like just satire trying to make fun of it because he's just against it. He's against God, he's against what God stands for. And as I'm thinking about what we're talking about with this Devo, um, I realized like if I was to be as violent towards him as he was towards me, right? And I use that in the broader sense of that word, right? If I was to immediately respond with, okay, I'm going to take this guy down, right? That might not be the best tactic to use. Actually, I think the best tactic to use is love, to engage in conversation, to still care for him, to give him rides home. You know, like the actual loving care that God calls us to do, which if we're honest with ourselves, we should be compelled to do because it is exactly what God did for us,
Hmm.
right? God didn't aggressively come and destroy us. He loved us, and that love is what freed us. So this week, for anybody watching the Devo, or for both of us as well, something that I'm thinking of is what does it look like for me to love enemies? And we also have to include ourselves in that. What does it look like for me to love myself? What does it look like for me to love my enemies, to pray for my enemies, and for that to be the way that they are set free? Is that a different mindset that we need to put ourselves in as Christians in how we interact with the world?
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's really what I kind of sense God just wanted to share with us. As you go throughout this week, as you engage with anybody that you find yourself engaging in, maybe even as we're talking, there's somebody that comes to your mind, somebody that's frustrating, somebody that's a struggle to be with, somebody that doesn't understand. Maybe even it's your own personal struggles. What does it look like to love them? And I think we have to be honest. If we have not received this love from God, that has to come first. The only reason why I have any capacity to love my enemies is because I was first loved by God. In all reality, the only reason why I have the capacity to love myself is because I was first loved by God. God showed me how loved I am, which freed me to actually be able to love myself and then love others. So if that is something that you have not experienced or you have questions about, get in contact with us and let us know. We would love to share that with you and to walk with you in that journey. For the rest of us, what does it look like to share that love with others? What does it look like to have a mindset where the tactic of advancing our kingdom, of carrying on the mission of God, of fighting to rescue people, is through love? And not just love as a feeling, but love as an action.